Hi, everyone. My name is Steve Schwartz. I'm the author of a series of top-selling LSAT guides, the most popular of which are the day-by-day study plans. At this point, they've collectively sold over 20,000 copies. So I'm pretty excited about that. Most recently, I released a series of LSAT checklists, and there's some information in the description below this video if you'd like to find out more. But today, I'm doing something different. I'm here to answer your questions specifically about the lead up to the September LSAT, which is just over 1 week away. So I'll ask that you try to keep your questions limited to things that are relevant to that topic. So specifically what to do in the final week. What are your worries, your fears, your anxieties, your questions about what to do, what to bring, what to do on the day of, what to do afterwards. But first, I want to share a story with you. It's a story about my own LSAT test day experience, and this is something that I don't think I've actually ever shared with anyone through my website before. So here goes. On the morning of the LSAT, I was nervous, of course. I had read that it's good to eat protein because protein is brain food, it's brain power. So I had a bagel with a can of tuna fish on it. And I woke up at around 6 in the morning. And so I subjected my stomach to this brutal breakfast within about 20 minutes of waking up. And I had never done that before. Needless to say, it did not go well. About 5 minutes after eating that bagel, I got nauseous. I went to the bathroom and I threw the whole thing up. And I was sweating and nervous because I had just put my system through quite a bit. And I was like, oh my God, what do I do now? So the show must go on. I cleaned up. I went on the road down to the test center. I was taking the exam at Pace University in downtown Manhattan. I stopped at a fruit stand on the way down. I grabbed a banana, and that was all I ate. So I ate on a pretty light stomach after all. And I went into the test, recovered okay, and ended up getting my 175. So I guess that just goes to show that it doesn't really matter if you face an obstacle on the morning of the exam. You still can overcome it. You can still pull all of your knowledge and experience and strategies together and surpass whatever obstacles may come your way. If I had it to do over again, I would certainly have done that part differently. I would recommend eating a bit lighter. Protein's still good, but maybe not quite a full can of tuna fish. Maybe pilot what you're going to eat the morning of on a few mornings prior. So let's say you're taking the exam on a Saturday. You might want to do a dry run on Thursday or Wednesday if you can, or this coming weekend, do a full-length exam, 5 sections, and eat the exact same breakfast that you're going to eat on test day, and try to keep all other aspects of that morning as similar as possible. And then hopefully you can avoid something like what I experienced on my LSAT test day. So that's my story. I'll keep it brief for now. I'm sure I'll share more as this chat goes on. But now I'm open to your questions, really anything at all. I certainly have some topics that I can talk about, but that's not really what I'm here for. My agenda for tonight is you guys. So just please feel free, type in the chat box and share with me your most pressing concerns, what's on your mind, what can I help with, and I'll do what I can to answer your questions as thoroughly as possible. So please feel free, type in the chat. I know it's on slow mode, so you might not be able to type immediately, but if anyone has a question or thought that they want to share with me, please feel free. One question that I've been asked recently is about how to avoid the dreaded test day drop. And I certainly have some comments on that I can share with you. So what is the test day drop? It's when someone is scoring around a particular range in the lead up to the exam, and then for one reason or another, they end up scoring at least a few points below their expected score range. Now, there are a number of reasons this can happen. Among them are nerves and anxiety. Among them are not having simulated test day conditions properly. And that can involve anything from not being ready for distractions. And those could be noise distractions, movement distractions. Those can be something like the test having 2 games sections back to back when you weren't ready for them, or even potentially 3 logical reasoning sections back to back when you weren't ready for that. So on that one, what can you do? Well, you can take a practice test that mimics that exact possibility. Whatever you're most afraid of, that's what you need to simulate before walking in. So if someone distracting walking around you would make your hair stand on end, have a friend do that to you on your next practice exam, or take your next practice exam in a library or a Starbucks to simulate that ambient noise. Of course, there are plenty of video simulators online that mirror those distractions in case you want to give yourself a dry run of what that would be like. You can also relate to anxiety. There's a number of things you can do. One of them, which I recommend frequently, is mindfulness meditation. Simply 5 minutes focusing on your breath can really make an enormous difference. Even if you started doing that now, over the next week or so, that would have an impact. It would give you the focus to remain calm and collected and on point if you encounter a question that you are especially bogged down by and you want to maintain the confidence to deal with it and move on. I could go on with more, but I'll leave off there for now on this one and check to the chat here for what else is going on. So Sophia asks, would you recommend taking practice exams the week of the actual exam? Yes. However, I wouldn't recommend taking too many. A lot of times students run the risk of burnout, especially in the final week, by doing 2 full-length exams on consecutive days, back to back. So that would be maybe Wednesday and Thursday of next week, or Saturday and Sunday of this coming weekend. Not a good idea. For a couple of reasons. One of them is that this will inevitably lead to burnout for the simple reason that you're putting your brain through too much. After taking a full-length 5-section exam, which is at a minimum a 3.5-hour experience, that's going to fry your brain. My brain is certainly fried whenever I do this. And so it's good to take a break. Sometimes less is more. And what you can do is perhaps take a full-length exam this Saturday, or if you have some time off next week, next Monday. And then you spend the following day doing nothing but reviewing that exam. Nothing but reviewing that exam. And proper review can take at least 3 to 4 hours. Let's say you scored really well and you got a 170. Awesome. A 170 is about 10 questions wrong. But that's not all you want to review. You also have maybe the 15 or so questions where you had difficulty. Maybe you were down to 2 and you guessed and got lucky, or maybe you got it right, but you could have gotten it right more quickly. So reviewing each of those questions, a minimum of 5 to 10 minutes per question, that is going to add up. What does your review process look like? It involves going through in painstaking detail the following. What was tempting about the wrong answer choice that made you pick it? And what ultimately made it wrong? What was discouraging about the right answer choice that pushed you away from it? And what ultimately made it correct in the end? You're looking for the patterns in the tricks the test makers use, and specifically the tricks that you're susceptible to. You'll notice over time that there are patterns in the tricks that you're falling for. And you want to spot those patterns and be ready for them so that next time you'll spot it and you won't end up picking it. I worked with a student earlier today and we were going over a reading comp passage. And we found that 2 of the questions he got wrong for the exact same reason. It was that the first half of the answer choice was extremely appealing. It was spot on. But the second half of the answer choice is where it went wrong. So he was reading too quickly and choosing answer choices too spontaneously without fully going through the process. And his major insight for our coaching session was read the answer choice thoroughly and also go through all 5 answer choices. And so if you want to do this properly, it's going to take more than simply exam after exam after exam, checking the answer key, saying to yourself, oh yeah, I get that now, and then moving on. It actually takes longer sometimes to review an exam or to review a question than it does to complete that question. At a minimum, you want to spend 5 minutes per LR question, for example, and preferably more. And you can look at explanations, mine or others, doesn't really matter. But the real work comes from your review process, not from reading foundational texts or watching explanation videos. The work comes from your thought process. And you can only do that so much. If you're doing 2 or 3 exams over the next week and reviewing those 2 or 3 exams thoroughly, you're not really going to have time to do much else. And that's okay. I'd rather you do fewer exams and go through them in more depth than do a greater number just to measure your results and have a larger data set of where you stand. That's not quite as useful as the review process. Got another question here from Akansha. When we're going over our prep test the week of the exam, what do you think is an efficient way of reviewing? Yeah, I pretty much actually just answered that one, I suppose. If there's any other further clarification you'd like on reviewing, I'm certainly happy to offer it. Got a question here from Lindsay. Obviously, this varies. Approximately how many full-timed practice tests do you think someone should have completed before the actual exam? Great question, Lindsay. I would recommend the average student complete at least 10 full-length exams. And that's assuming that you have a period of at least 2 to 3 months to study, which would be about 1 exam per week on average, but they would not necessarily be spaced 1 week at a time. Maybe if you had only 2 to 3 months to study, you would spend the first third of that time on building your foundation, then working on individual timed sections, and then finally bringing it all together to work on your endurance and your stamina, building up to the 5-section experience, which, like I said, it really is exhausting. You don't want to put yourself through that too much. And you certainly don't want to do an extra exam the day before the real thing, just so that you can squeeze one more in. The day before the real thing should be a rest day. You're not doing any studying at all. You're spending that day getting a massage, taking a hot bath, spending some time in nature, binge watching Netflix, going to the movies, relaxing, whatever that is for you. It could be mindfulness, it could be yoga, it could be a relatively light workout or jog, but it shouldn't be anything too strenuous. And if you've only done, let's say, 5 exams, that could be enough. I would typically recommend doing at least 8 though, and preferably 10 if possible. Happy to clarify further. Akansha asked a follow-up to the review, so I'll answer that one. I know it's important to go over wrong questions, but should we also go over our correct questions to confirm our way of thinking to why the answer is correct? Great question. And in a perfect world, of course, you would want to review everything. But here's the issue. If you're doing 10 practice tests timed, that's about 1,000 questions. You don't have time to review 1,000 questions thoroughly, and it's not necessarily productive to do so. I'd rather you review those. Let's say you got a 170, awesome, 10 wrong there, 15 you were unsure of or could have done better. That's 25 questions, and that's a good day, right? So 25 questions, you're prioritizing the ones that gave you difficulty, which is great. Focus on those, and that'll be enough. Yeah, of course, it would be nice to review the others also, but you have limited time and you can only do so much. So I'd rather you focus on the ones you got wrong and or you had difficulty with, and leave it at that. That should be enough for you. And if you find there was something you were unsure of, where maybe there was a particularly difficult game or a particularly difficult passage, and maybe you got 3 of them confidently right and 4 of them you got wrong or were unsure of, yeah, you could look at explanations for the ones you got right there too, just in case. Maybe there's a game where there was a particular inference that you could have done a better job with. Maybe you could have made multiple main diagrams. Maybe there was something you could have done to solve it more efficiently, and the explanations will shed light on that. Or maybe reviewing and redoing a game or a passage will also show you something new. So that could be valuable, and I would recommend it, but going through every single question you took on the exam period would simply take too long if you're reviewing in the kind of detail that I'm talking about. Happy to discuss review in detail, because it is a really important topic though. So any clarifying questions, happy to answer. Chris asks, the only points I miss are rule substitution questions and then some others. I'll focus on rule substitution for now. Rule substitution has come up pretty consistently in the past couple dozen exams, so it is worth discussing and focusing on. Every exam in recent memory has had at least one and sometimes two. A couple of quick tips on those questions. First of all, you want something that is no more limiting and no less limiting than the original rule. What that means is that if you have a previous scenario that you know to be valid, and your proposed answer choice for a rule substitution question renders your previous hypothetical invalid, then it is more limiting than what you want, more limiting than the original, and it could not possibly be correct. And for that reason, it's invalid, you can eliminate it. Similarly, if your proposed answer choice, when combined with the original rules, results in a main diagram that allows scenarios that previously would not have been permitted, then it is less limiting than the original, and it's invalid for that reason. You want a rule, a proposed answer choice that, when combined with the original rules, gives you an identical main diagram with identical inferences. It may not look exactly the same, but it will have the exactly same inferences following. So for example, a global must be true under the original scenario would also hold under this new proposed hypothetical answer choice. So some tips on that. Other questions weren't specific to test day in particular. I covered rule substitution because it's something that is on the newer exams. Let's see. Rick, in your observation of the best test takers, how long do you think they take for each section? I find test day adrenaline to sometimes result in varied or volatile sessions. Sometimes it takes longer or you get through it faster. Great question. The best test takers I find are able to complete the section rather, with about 3 to 5 minutes remaining. That's an ideal. It's not for everybody. Not everyone, even a 170 plus scorer, will do that. But that's a trend that I notice and one I've experienced myself. This relates to pacing, and it relates to not getting bogged down. So pacing, logical reasoning, I would aim to complete the first 10 questions in about 10 to 12 minutes. Then you're completing the remainder of this section with an average question type that's greater than your overall average. You have about 1:25 per question on LR on average. So you want to have more time, of course, for the tougher questions later in the section. And you want to have a time bank. You want to have those 3 to 5 minutes at the end of the section so that you can go back and tackle the tougher questions that you would have previously skipped. So again, another tip embedded in there is skip questions. Skip the toughest ones. That could be number 21 is a parallel question, and you look at that and you're like, that's going to take too long, or I already don't get the method of reasoning in the stimulus, and I understand that I'm reading 6 stimuli for the benefit of one correct answer, one in the stimulus and 5 in the answer choices. And that takes a lot of time. You want to practice triage. You want to tackle your lowest hanging fruit first. So parallel questions, principal application questions, questions on topics you don't like. For me, it might typically be science or philosophy questions, where it's tough to parse out exactly what it means. And sure, with unlimited time or with 10 minutes in one question, you might figure it out, but there is stress, it's real, and the fight or flight response kicks in. And so if you find that you're getting bogged down on a tough question where you are investing more time and not getting a return on your time invested, it's time to have the mindfulness to put that aside and come back to it later. Maybe you'll get to it, maybe you won't, but at least it was your lowest hanging fruit, so it's valuable to save that one for last. I'll typically find that when I do an LR section timed under test day conditions, I might mark off 4 questions that I skip. I'll put an asterisk next to it. Maybe I was down to 2 on a couple of those, and maybe I'll even bubble that in. But I'm not 100% sure, and I know that I need to devote more time to this, and so I'll save that for the end, because sometimes question 25 or 26 is actually easier than question number 21. Your mileage may vary from other students based on the question type, as well as the topic, as well as the method of reasoning. All of these things can play a role, so don't be afraid to skip and come back. On games and reading comp passage, I might complete the easier game or passage in 6 minutes, and then build up a time bank for the tougher game or passage that comes later. 8:45 per game or passage is only an average. Not all of them are of equal difficulty. And with games and passages, it's not always easy to tell, of course, but you want to complete the easier ones faster. That is really important. So don't second guess yourself on something that seems easy. If it seems easy, especially if it's early in the section, it probably is. You're going to want that time for later, especially if you're aiming to complete all 4 games or passages, and you're shooting for, of course, a 165 plus score. To cover the question fully, of course, section timing can vary. Not every LR passage is created equal. Same goes for the others. You might complete a section only at time, and that's fine. Maybe you don't answer every question. That's also fine. If you don't get to 2 of them, and they were the 2 hardest, you're in good shape, because you might have gotten those wrong anyway, and you did the best you could, and that's fine. Let's see. Ian asks, is there a large amount of time allotted for pre-section bubbling, like numbers, demographic data, etc., or should you have all that info memorized and ready to quickly fill out? Great question. All of that housekeeping stuff, where you, like old school, like the SAT, you're bubbling in your name and your address and it takes a half hour. All of that stuff you're doing before the clock starts ticking. Let's say the test starts at 9 o'clock. You're going over the instructions at 8:15, 8:30 with the proctor, and they're giving you as long as it takes the slowest person in the room to do all that stuff. So don't worry about that. Of course, you want to have your admission ticket. You want to have any necessary information with you, but you don't have to stress about completing all that information quickly. Shireen asks, what realizations did you make in your studying that you didn't read in prep books that helped you the most? Great question, Shireen. A lot of the stuff that I read on forums and blog posts actually got me overly stressed out and was contrary to what I needed to hear. First of all, you notice that a lot of students take exam after exam after exam, and they're creating spreadsheets with the last 30 exams they've taken. And I did that too. And it turned out that one of the key realizations for me, and you don't read this in prep books, is don't take so many exams. Like I said earlier, it's better to take fewer exams and review them in more depth than to take a greater number just to go through the motions and get more exams under your belt. So that was one key realization for me. Fewer exams, quality, not quantity. The review process that I discussed earlier was also extremely helpful for me. And that was a realization I didn't get from a book. Finally, the biggest realization I got was to look at the exam from the test maker's perspective. Not from the perspective that I'm stupid and trying to get smarter and trying to beat this exam and this test is nonsense and doesn't test anything real and even do things like argue with the answer key. My real insights came when I started viewing the exam from the test maker's perspective, seeing it from their point of view, dissecting it, looking at how it was constructed. If I were to create an LSAC question, what would that process look like? What tricks would I use in order to lure test takers into a false sense of security and lure them down an incorrect pathway? I learned more than ever about the LSAT when I started writing my own LSAT questions. I actually wrote about 7 or 8 actual LSAT logic games of my own, and you can see them on my website. And when I went through that process, I learned a great deal. First of all, it's a lot harder to write LSAT questions than you would think. In particular, writing the wrong answer choices is really hard. Because sure, you could write an answer choice that nobody would ever pick, like the president of the United States is ... Homer Simpson. That's obviously wrong, and only the lowest possible score would choose something like that. But it's the more tempting wrong answer choices that are especially important because, first of all, they're the ones that you're most likely to pick, and they go down particular false logical pathways, like making a mistake when taking the contrapositive of something, or having an answer choice that is the polar opposite rather than the logical opposite of something. You get the idea. But if you want to score 165 or 170 plus, you've got to think like the test makers and ask yourself, what would a 170 plus scorer be able to do? The smartest person I know, what would they be able to do? And then orient your studying in that way so that you could get there too. I think that about covers that one for now. Miss Andrea G asks, on average, how many questions can you miss and still score 170 plus? The raw score conversions vary based on exam. They change from exam to exam, but on average, you can get about 10 or 11 questions wrong and get exactly a 170. So what does that 170 look like? The average 170 scorer is getting 3 wrong on each LR section, 3 wrong on reading comp, and then maybe -1 on games. So 3 wrong on the LRs and the RC, 1 wrong on games, that's a 170. And those ratios tend to hold downwards through the distributions. So if you want a top score, you've got to perfect games. It's much easier to perfect games than it is to perfect reasoning or reading comp because games have the mathematical reliability that the other sections don't. The other sections have the ambiguities of language that are much more difficult to parse out. Especially in reading comp, what you're often doing is looking for the best of the worst rather than something that you're going to predict or fall in love with. So keep that in mind. That's why it's especially important to do and redo games in particular to perfect those. Rick asks, regarding your tip on skipping tough questions, have you seen successful students who begin the test with the difficult questions? I've heard of people having that idea. I don't know whether it works, and I don't love it myself. The reason I don't love it is because of timing. You have a very severe time constraint of 35 minutes. This constraint is unreasonable. The test is constructed so that most people will not be able to complete the questions in the time allotted, which is incredibly unfair from one perspective. It's nuts to me that you could get 10 questions wrong out of 100. That means 90% accuracy and score in the 97th percentile. 90% accuracy, 97th percentile. That's very strange when you think about it. What that suggests is that the time constraint is real, it's severe, and the clock is always ticking for us. And if you do the most difficult questions first, you're tackling your highest hanging fruit first rather than your lowest hanging fruit. So how would you feel if you tackled that tough parallel reasoning question, which was number 21, the tough principal application question, that was number 23, and then you never got to the easiest questions? So you tackled the tough questions first. Maybe you got them right, maybe you got them wrong, but your odds are lower on those than they are on the easier questions. So this strategy seems like it has a strong likelihood of failure, in my opinion, and I wouldn't recommend anyone do it. And if you are going to try something as radical as this, I would suggest trying it out at least a few times before the test on practice exams, rather than on the real thing, and see how it goes for you. My guess is that it won't work out very well, but hey, everyone's different and to each their own. Apologize for pronunciation here. Hey You asks, may I ask how you tackled science articles for reading comp? I would tackle them the same way I would tackle any other. And obviously, science is going to be harder for a lot of folks, especially folks from the humanities, or in my case, political science. The hard sciences or natural sciences are not always my cup of tea. I was reviewing one passage with a student earlier today. This was, I think it was test 53, passage 4. It was on the Typhlodromus and cyclamen mites. And these are little predator mites and prey mites that are eating strawberry crops or something like that. And Typhlodromus, cyclamen, mites, pesticides, these are not topics that most of us are familiar with. I don't even know that I'm saying the word cyclamen correctly, but it doesn't matter. How I tackle something like that, for example, I would be looking to make the topic as real world relatable as possible. I dumb it down for myself, and I try to substitute terminology or even topics that are easier to get my head around. I'm referencing test 53 here because it's one that many of you have probably done and you're not saving for the final week. If you are, then just cover your ears for the next couple minutes. But in this passage, the cyclamen mites are attacking the strawberry fields, and the Typhlodromus are brought in to eat the cyclamen mites. So I thought about this as the cyclamen mites are the mice eating the grain in our warehouse, and the Typhlodromus are the cats that we bring in to eat the mice. So we have a pest, we bring in cats to attack that pest. The cats are good, the mice are bad from our perspective right now, and we don't necessarily want the cats there, but we brought them in because they had a job that would be helpful to us and they were able to do it. So I analogize. I make a real world analogy that I can more easily understand. I do that whenever possible. I caricature, I exaggerate in order to make it more relatable and more real world for myself. That's my little mental hack or trick that I use for a lot of science passages, and it tends to work pretty well. Overall, I try to avoid getting bogged down in the details, and I read for structure like I always would. So I'm reading for the viewpoints, the details, and the supporting examples. The viewpoints, the evidence, and the advocates. Who, if anyone, is advocating a particular position? That's what I'm looking for. Eugene asks, how do I review? I covered that one earlier. How do I internalize the mistakes and actual fallacies I overlooked to not miss a similar question next time? Great question. How do I internalize? How do I see those patterns? Part of it is doing a large volume of questions in a relatively short period of time. And that way, you will start to see the connections more and more. Part of it's also doing a large volume of questions. And you don't want to cram this. I'm not saying do 3 or 4 exams in the final week. Like I said earlier, that's too much. But you do want to study over a long enough period of time such that you've done a good 10 exams at least. And that's 500 LR questions and 250 games questions, 250 reasoning questions. And you've got enough under your belt that you could better see those patterns. One thing you can do is do questions by type. So that could be for LR question stem type. For games, that could be game type. But there's also patterns in methods of reasoning. And that's a bit tougher to spot. No one categorizes it that way for LR, in part because it would take far too long to categorize everything that way. It's not as immediately apparent as it is for, let's say, logical reasoning question stems. But through your review process, if you are writing things out rather than just saying, oh yeah, I get it when you look at the correct answer choice, you're actually writing out, maybe even by hand in a notebook if you want to be old-fashioned about it. Also because writing in a notebook has a higher retention rate and a higher engagement rate. If you're typing, the letter D is no different than the letter H to your fingers, other than which finger you're pressing. But when you write things down, you're actually solidifying the concepts in your brain more thoroughly. And that means maybe you're more likely to remember when you get a question wrong that it was similar to an earlier method of reasoning. On my website, under the logical reasoning tab, I have one article titled "Two Tough Flaw Questions That Were Similar to Each Other," or something like that. These were two questions that were about 20 exams apart from each other. One was like in the 30s and one was in the teens. And I noticed that they had very similar flaws. And these were weird flaws. These were more abstract flaws. And these sorts of flaws, these methods of reasoning, might only show up once every 10 exams. And so if you're only doing 5 or 10 exams, you're not necessarily going to have a large enough data set to see those patterns. But the more exams that you do, the more patterns you'll be exposed to. Also, you might want to work through flaw questions by flaw type specifically. On my website, under the logical reasoning tab, I have a spreadsheet that's also a list. And it lists various question types. And in the flaw category, you can see in parentheses for many of them which classic logical fallacy they exhibit. And because there are so many fallacies, you might only have 10 questions ever that exhibit a particular fallacy within the flaw question stem category. But if you do all 10 of those in a row, you'll really solidify your understanding of what that method of reasoning is. Another thing you could do is you could go through the abstract language in flaw answer choices. Even if the correct answer was A, you could go through B, C, D, and E, which are worded very abstractly perhaps. They might use words like takes the consequent to mean the antecedent or something like that, which is referring to necessary and sufficient conditions. But if you actually parse out what all that abstract terminology means, you will be deepening your understanding of how flaws are described in the abstract, how an ad hominem flaw might be described, or how a correlation causation flaw might be described, so that when you predict or prephrase the flaw for yourself, you will actually recognize it in the answer choices when it comes up. So I hope that was helpful. Jerry Liu asks, if I'm scoring 160 now and I'm aiming for 170 plus in November, could you recommend a study plan? This video, I'm trying to focus primarily on students studying for the next week, but for those who might be retaking, I'll briefly touch on this. If you want a 170 plus by November, you're studying over, let's say, about a 2.5 to 3 month period. You want to focus on building your foundation over the first few weeks, working under untimed conditions, then gradually move on to timed sections, and finally full-length timed exams. Since you're not starting from scratch, I take it by now, you might want to also identify your weak areas and focus on those. Maybe drill questions by type, maybe review foundational materials, textbook type stuff, or articles on my site, and look at those to solidify your understanding of any particular question type or section. I want to focus on September exam takers though. Let's see, I know Akansha had another question. I want to tackle that. How to properly review reading comp questions, tips for reading comp in general. So first of all, reviewing reading comp, it would be similar to how I discussed reviewing logical reasoning. What was tempting about the wrong answer choice? What ultimately made it wrong? What was discouraging about the right answer, and what ultimately pushed you away from it? You might also want to think more generally about how you're allocating time within reading comp. I typically recommend spending 2.5 to 3 minutes on your initial read of the passage, and then the remaining time on solving the questions. The reason for this is that you have about 6 to 7 questions per passage. If you spend any less than 2.5 to 3 minutes on your initial read, or I'm sorry, any more than 2.5 to 3 minutes on your initial read of the passage, you're going to have significantly less than a minute per question. And that's not really a lot of time, especially given that the answer choices in reading comp are constructed to be unappealing more so than anywhere else. It's the best of the worst, and you want to work by process of elimination. So for that reason, I strongly recommend getting through the passage and walking away primarily with the main idea. You want to know mainly what's the main idea, what was the primary purpose, what was the author's opinion, if any. And you want to leave it at that. The details, the supporting examples, the evidence, you can always go back to that when you need it. And your mapping of the passage, your read of the passage, should focus on structure such that you will have a general idea of where to go back when you want to go back. And you can hunt for it when you need it. But given how difficult the topics are and how unfamiliar they are, I would not recommend trying to absorb everything up front. It's just too much. I'm happy to clarify further. A contract I saw you also asked, for logic games on test day, should we have a plan for how many games we want to attempt? Absolutely, 100%. If you're aiming for 165 plus, I would recommend attempting everything, all games, all passages, all logical reasoning. And the reason for this is that anything you don't attempt, your odds are really only 1 in 5, most likely. And you are sacrificing a great number of questions if you're skipping a whole game or passage. And then you also have to consider that your accuracy rate on the ones you do attempt is not going to be 100%. So for that reason, you've got to attempt everything in order to get enough right. Again, for 170, you need to get no more than about 10 questions wrong, which really is not very many. So got to work on everything. And you got to have a plan for this as well. You don't want to just decide in the moment on test day, oh, I was going to do 4, now I'm going to only do 3, or vice versa, because that affects your pacing. That affects your endurance. And you don't want to do anything for the first time on test day. You want to have done everything at least once as a practice run before the real thing, so you can work out any kinks and build those structures in your mind, build that pacing for what it's going to be like on the real thing. Let's see, what else are there questions here? Let's see. Hayu asks, would you recommend elimination for reading comp and logical reasoning? Absolutely, 100%. Process of elimination is something I would recommend for every single section, every single question type. Sometimes, of course, you can predict, you can pre-phrase. When you can, that's awesome. But this is a multiple choice exam, and LSAC's wording is not always our wording. They like to make things difficult. They like to use abstract or obtuse language. And for that reason, you're often looking for the best of the worst. You might have an idea in mind, but even if you predict it, you're not necessarily going to love the way that LSAC articulates it. And so for that reason, you might simply need to eliminate things when they're not what you were looking for. And then whatever is left, even if you don't love the wording, you've got to be okay with picking it. Another big insight that I got that I didn't get from any test prep book was that I had to learn to be comfortable choosing a choice that I did not even understand the meaning of. Think for a moment how difficult that is. I had to learn to choose a choice where I did not understand the meaning of the choice. This is really difficult to do because I had no clue what it was saying, but I knew that the other 4 choices were all wrong. I was able to eliminate the other 4, and so by process of elimination, by deduction, I had to accept the fact that this answer choice, whatever it meant, was the correct answer. And to my great relief, it was correct. And then later, of course, upon review, after the fact, you can figure out why it was correct, but really useful strategy. And of course, on games, you want to do this as well, but I guess that's a given. Rick asks, during test day, if I have time remaining and I find myself using this leftover review time inefficiently, the brain is tired. I get that. What are your best practice suggestions? So on the official exam day, if you have time left and you've completed all the questions, you're feeling pretty good about them, and you feel like any extra time you spend on the questions themselves is actually going to be counterproductive or maybe a wash at best, then put your head down and rest, dude. It's okay. The fact that you have 3 sections back to back, a short break, and then 2 more back to back, that's a lot. That's exhausting. And so if you could give yourself a minute or 2 in between sections, and that could freshen you up for the next section to come, that's fine. Take it. However, if you find that you have 3 to 5 minutes remaining and you have a handful of questions that you were not sure of, or you think might be worthy of another look, then I would recommend going back and giving those another shot, or giving them another look. Maybe you'll see something that you didn't see before. And of course, also practice this during your next upcoming timed practice exam. Walk through it and see what that looks like. See what that experience looks like for you. Is the extra couple minutes having your head down to rest, is it valuable? Or are you finding that there was something that you were not sure of? And maybe you would have been better off giving that another look. And maybe the benefit of that extra point is worth having less rest time in between sections. Nobody can tell you what to do here. This is something that you've got to figure out for yourself during your next couple of practice runs before test day. But it's a valid strategy to rest. I'm not going to discount that. Akansha asks, when we practice with a 5-section prep test, should we also review the extra section? Absolutely. There is no reason not to. And the question becomes, what was your extra section? Not what type it was, but where is it from? If you're doing an exam in the 70s or the 80s, is your extra section from the teens, or is it also from the 70s or the 80s? Is it from something relatively recent? One thing I often recommend for students is, let's say that you're doing exams 81 to 84 as your full-length time practice exams. You could take an individual section from test 80, take test 80, divide it into 4, and insert one of the 4 sections from test 80 into each of 81 to 84. After you've completed 4 timed exams, 81 to 84, you then have also completed exam 80, and you can score that separately. And it's valuable to review that material, in part because it's recent, but also because it's something that you did timed. And of course, you want to give it your full effort, just like you would anything else. And you have the benefit to gain in understanding from that extra section as well. Treat it like it's real, review it like it's real, because it's no less valuable than the stuff that you were scoring out of your 4 from a defined, coherent prep test. So yeah, the short answer is yes. Jennifer asks, is 2 months enough time to practice for a retake? How should it be structured? Great question, Jennifer. So let's say you're going for September, but you might withdraw, you might cancel, you might get a score you don't like. And that happens. People are retaking more than ever. So let's say that whatever happens, you take it on September 8th, you don't, doesn't matter. You have at that point about 2 months and 1 week to prepare for your retake or your next take. What do? Well, at this point, you've already probably been studying for a while. You could focus on your weak areas, shore up anything that you weren't 100% confident in. And you can take that time to build your foundation and solidify your foundation, then move on to timed sections, then move on to full-length exams. The difference for you at this point is going to be that you probably already have somewhat of a decent foundation. So you want to spend less time on foundational materials and articles and explanations, and rather on your own review process and on taking more full-length timed exams. Like I said earlier, you want to do maybe 10 timed exams at least in the lead up to test day. So for that reason, spread them out. You could do 1 a week. Let's say that you're working full-time or you're in school. 2 exams a week might be plenty. It might be all you could do. If you are only working part-time or you have a light course load or you're just studying full-time, then you could certainly do 2 exams a week. 3 might be pushing it. You could play that by ear. For anyone studying full-time or close to full-time, burnout is a real risk that you run. And so for that reason, I would not suggest doing 3 exams a week every week. And I certainly would not suggest doing more than 3 exams a week. Again, it's a recipe for burnout to do exams on consecutive days. If you were doing 3 exams a week and taking the following day from each to review in detail, that would still give you just 1 day off. And 1 day off is great. You might want to take 2 days off per week. That's okay. You might also have days or weeks where you get sick, or you go on vacation, or you have other priorities, family stuff comes up. All of that's fine. If you take a week off over the next 2 months, that's not going to ruin your score. You can be gentle on yourself, especially since you've already been studying for a while, I would guess. So the individual process for studying for a retake will vary from person to person, and it will vary based on your weak areas, but the other aspects I mentioned are all fairly constant. Pretender JL asks, how much time should we spend reviewing per exam? In part, that will depend on how many questions you get wrong on that exam. I would recommend spending at least 5 to 10 minutes per question that you get wrong. And I'm talking individual question here. This process could take at least 2 to 3 hours, maybe even 3 to 4 hours if you're really giving it your all. And I'm talking about writing things out by hand, writing full paragraphs for every question that you get wrong or have difficulty with. Even if you got something right, but you were down to 2 and you guessed and got lucky, that's still wrong in my book because it could have gone the other way. So really take the time to review for yourself on your own, independent of any explanations. And then also, in addition to the explanations, you could watch explanation videos. You could read written explanations. I have video explanations for the vast majority of prep tests on my website. If you go to the free stuff tab under logic games, there's free LSAT logic games explanation videos you can watch for the vast majority of exams. I also have written explanations available under the books tab on my website. And those are all really valuable. You could use them as well. But of course, the bulk of the work is going to come from doing the review on your own. So take the time. That's really where the pattern recognition and the gains in understanding come from. The reason you take exams is not simply to see how you'll do. Of course, that's nice. It's not simply just to work on your pacing and work on your endurance. It's to give yourself the opportunity to get questions wrong and then to learn from those mistakes. Kind of like during mindfulness meditation. The benefit is not spending 5 minutes being proud of yourself for the percentage of time that you spend actually focused on your breath or whatever else you're focusing on. The benefit is in when your mind wanders and you have the moment where you notice it. Those moments where you notice your mind wandering and you bring it back, you circle back to your focus, whether it's the focus on your mantra or the focus on your breath. That's where the progress happens. That's where you strengthen yourself. That's where you gain the benefit. So when you get questions wrong or have difficulty with them, the act of recognizing why you got it wrong, that's the gain in understanding. That's what we're looking for. When I work with students, I'll often say to them, between now and our next session, get 50 questions wrong, get 100 questions wrong. I don't want you to be afraid of getting questions wrong because every question you get wrong or have difficulty with is an opportunity to learn something new. And that's the real benefit. I'd rather students do hard questions and get them wrong than do easier questions and get them right and be happy about it. Sure, it's an ego boost, but the gain in understanding from getting something wrong after you, and then upon your review, that's the benefit. That is what I want you to work on over the next week. Over the next week, take a few exams, get 50 questions wrong. and spend 3 to 5 hours reviewing those questions, and you will gain understanding that will help you avoid making that mistake the next time. Jennifer asks, have you reviewed the Khan Academy LSAT course? I haven't reviewed the whole thing. I did consult for them a bit while they were developing it, and I looked at their curriculum outline, and I think it's decent. I think it's good. It's free, so you can't beat the price. However, the Khan Academy course was developed in conjunction with LSAC. And LSAC, as we know, has a very specific way of viewing the exam. And LSAC also has an interest in students not beating the exam. They have an interest in separating students all along the spectrum from 120 to 180. LSAC constructs the exam so they can separate those from the 120s, from those in the 130s, and those in the 150s from those in the 160s, and etc. Now, their interest is not in helping students make massive score increases. And so I'm automatically skeptical of anything that is put out in conjunction with the LSAC, just like I'd be skeptical of anything put out for SAT prep in conjunction with the College Board. LSAC is in an arms race with students and with test prep providers such as myself. Part of the reason the LSAT has gotten harder in recent years is because the quality of test prep materials has improved significantly, in part due to the internet, in part due to the rise of free and low-cost materials, in part due to the rise of quality materials that are in contrast to those offered by the big prep companies, which cater to the lowest common denominator, which are the students seeking to simply break into the low 160s. I'm working with students who are seeking to break into the high 160s and the 170s and beyond. So I'm skeptical for that reason. That being said, I have not thoroughly looked at all the content of the Khan Academy course. You can try it out and see if it works for you. I suspect that given that the cost is free, if the quality is solid and head and shoulders above the rest, then you'll hear about it because everyone can try it and it'll circulate like wildfire. I haven't seen that so far, but it's still new. One thing to be aware of is that the Khan Academy uses a number of questions from recent exams, and they don't necessarily always tell you which exams they're pulling from. So I would be conscious of that, and I would look to identify the prep test they're using to make sure that they're not spoiling anything too recent for you that you might want to focus on later. But if you've got, I noticed that you were looking, Jennifer, to study maybe for November. So if that's the case, you certainly have time to try it out. And yeah, reach out. Let me know how it goes for you. Let me know if it's helpful. Lindsay asks, what are your thoughts about the November test being the only score that you apply with this fall? Is it detrimentally late in the application cycle? I heard that complete September and October applications are much better. Great question, Lindsay. So the question relates to the fact of rolling admissions and how important is rolling admissions? Is it better to apply earlier with, let's say, a July or September test score rather than wait to take in November when you might have more time to study and get a relatively higher score? The answer is that rolling admissions matters a lot less than it used to. Back in the day, let's say pre-recession, pre-2010, when there were far more students applying, the law schools were in a great position because they had tons of applicants with high scores. They could get an application in September and decide right away and not have to worry that someone better would come along later. Now, however, there has been a significant drop in the number of test takers in recent years. And so law schools are more desperate to get high scores. So they wait, they delay. They defer more students than ever before. They waitlist more students than ever before. What this means is they're waiting around to see who else comes along. And that's not very nice. That's not very fair. They're keeping you waiting for only their own self-interest. But it is what it is. What that means for you, though, is that there's more reason than ever to retake, to postpone, to withdraw, to wait to take the LSAT until you are confident that you have maximized your potential of getting the highest score possible for yourself. So let's say you wanted a 165 or a 170, and your recent results are all around 162. And the average of your most recent 5 timed exams is 162. Are you likely to get a 165? Maybe. Are you likely to get a 168 or 170? Probably not. And you have 1 week. Miracles can happen, but they're not common. So for that reason, I would recommend, if you're not scoring around where you want to be, and let's say you give it till the day before or 2 days before, you take an exam and it's still not what you wanted. Maybe you withdraw. That's okay. You can take in November and you have 2 more months to study. You can maximize your odds and apply with a much better score, and you will have basically no impact on your application given the timing. The timing doesn't matter that much. If you take in November, you're not really at any disadvantage from someone who took in September and applied immediately afterwards. Much better to take later and apply later with a higher score than apply now with a lower score. So keep that in mind and feel okay about postponing and waiting if that's what you need to do. Akansha asks, and this will be my last question, or maybe second to last question if another one comes along in the next few minutes. Akansha asks, when we do practice for a specific question type after looking at our weaknesses, should we time it? If so, how? Or should we just try to get them right? So this question, if I understand correctly, is about working by question type. Do you time yourself? It's tricky to do that, in part because not all questions are of equal difficulty. And if you're working on a defined section, then 35 minutes is a pretty clear marker of how long it should take. But if you're working through questions by type, especially tough questions, then it's hard to gauge how long it should take. On average, you have about 1:25 per LR question. But if you're working on tough ones, maybe it takes 2 minutes. Maybe it takes 2.5 minutes. Maybe it takes 3 minutes if it's one of those where you would have skipped it and come back to it at the end, and it's one of the hardest of all. If it's that number 21, that's a parallel reasoning question. It can and should take 3 minutes, and there's nothing wrong with that. So you wouldn't need to feel bad if it took you that long. So for that reason, I probably would not time when working through questions by type. I don't think it's useful to necessarily even keep count of how long it's taking you. Rather, when you're working by type, work under untimed conditions to gain a solid understanding and learn from your review and be okay with that. And then you can always do timed sections later and still get plenty of practice with the pacing and then later with the endurance. So I'm going to leave off here for now. It's just after 9 o'clock and it's time to go walk the dog. And so I want to thank you all for coming tonight. And please feel free to reach out and let me know if you need anything at all. And that goes for all of you watching this later as well. My email address is lsatunplugged@gmail.com. And if you join my email list, then you will be kept aware of all future Q&A sessions and all upcoming videos that I'm posting, which will be on a wide variety of test prep topics and LSAT topics in general, the sort of stuff that I'm not going to share in blog posts or forums or emails, because I just need to go deeper and need to have this interaction with you to make it more real and draw out that material that I have buried inside my brain. So keep in touch over the next week. Let me know if you need anything, and let me know how the September LSAT goes. Thanks for watching and listening, and take care. Good night.